year was 1810, and in the hills of Kentucky, men still traded in souls. But there was one man who refused to buy. Instead, he bought freedom itself. The wind howled across Pine Mountain like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving. Snow lay thick on the ground, 2 feet deep in places, turning the world into a vast white silence, broken only by the occasional crack of a frozen branch. Through this frozen wilderness, a massive figure moved with the careful patience of a predator. Ezra Blackwood stood 6'3" in his worn leather boots, 210 pounds of muscle and sinew wrapped in buckskin and fur. His beard, black as coal and thick as winter moss, hung down to his chest, never knowing the touch of scissors. His hair fell past his shoulders, bound with a strip of rawhide to keep it from his eyes. Those eyes, dark brown and sharp as a hawk's, tracked the massive paw prints in the snow before him. A grizzly bear, 400 pounds if it was an ounce. The tracks were fresh, no more than an hour old, the edges still crisp where the great claws had torn into the frozen earth beneath the snow. Ezra carried his Winchester rifle in his scarred hands, hands that looked like they'd been carved from oak and left in the weather for decades. A scar ran diagonal across his left eye, white against his sun-darkened skin, the gift of a mountain lion that had learned too late that Ezra Blackwood was not easy prey. The tracks led up a steep ridge, through a stand of pine trees so old they'd watched the last of the Cherokee pass through these mountains. Ezra followed, his breath making clouds in the frigid air. He made no more sound than the falling snow. Ahead, through the trees, he caught movement. The bear had stopped to dig at something, its massive shoulders working as it tore at the frozen ground. Ezra raised the Winchester, his finger resting light on the trigger. The bear was broadside, an easy shot. He could almost feel the weight of 400 pounds of meat, enough to last through the hardest part of winter. But he didn't squeeze the trigger. Instead, he watched. The bear wasn't hunting. It was digging at the roots of an old oak, looking for grubs and insects frozen in their winter sleep. It was hungry, like everything else in these mountains in December. But it wasn't starving. It would live to see spring. Ezra lowered the rifle. He'd killed his share of bears, more than his share probably, but he'd learned long ago that not every killing was necessary. Some things deserved to live simply because they were trying to live. He raised his head and let out a roar that would have done credit to the bear itself. The grizzly's head snapped up, eyes finding Ezra instantly. For a long moment, man and beast regarded each other across 30 yards of snow and pine needles. Then the bear turned and lumbered away into the deeper woods, moving with surprising speed for something so large. Ezra watched it go, then turned back toward home. His cabin sat another 2 miles up the mountain, tucked into a hollow where 3 ridges came together like the fingers of a grasping hand. He'd built it himself 15 years ago, when he was 26 and newly married. Back when the world had seemed like a place where a man could carve out something good if he worked hard enough and kept his head down. The cabin was small, just one room with a sleeping loft he'd never finished, built from pine logs he'd felled and stripped himself. Chinked with mud and moss, roofed with split shingles, it wasn't much to look at. But it had a stone fireplace that drew well, keeping the single room warm even when the wind screamed down from the peaks. And it had 2 graves beside it. He saw them as he approached through the last stand of trees. 2 mounds of stones, carefully placed and maintained, each topped with a wooden cross he'd carved from cedar. The graves of Rebecca Blackwood and Daniel Blackwood, his wife and his son, taken from him by scarlet fever 5 winters past. Rebecca had been 30 when she died, still beautiful despite the hard life of the mountains. Daniel had been 8, with his mother's smile and his father's stubborn chin. Ezra stopped at the graves like he did every morning, like he would do every morning until they laid him in the ground beside them. He'd picked wildflowers in summer, pine boughs in winter. Today he had nothing but his presence, so he gave them that. He stood for 5 full minutes in the falling snow, not praying exactly, because he'd lost his faith somewhere in the fever dreams of watching them die. But remembering the sound of Rebecca's laugh, remembering the way Daniel would run to meet him when he came home from hunting, remembering what it felt like to be something other than alone. Then, because standing in the snow, dwelling on ghosts was a good way to join them, he turned toward the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line. He'd banked the fire carefully before leaving at dawn, and it had kept itself alive through the morning. Inside, the cabin was warm and dim, lit only by the glow from the fireplace and the weak winter light coming through the single small window. The room smelled of wood smoke and cured meat and the particular mustiness that comes from a man living alone. His bed stood against one wall, a simple frame with a rope mattress and wool blankets. A table and two chairs occupied the center of the room, though he only ever used one chair now. The second had been Rebecca's, and he couldn't bring himself to sit in it or to burn it for firewood, so it just sat there gathering dust, a monument to absence. He hung his rifle on wooden pegs above the door and shrugged out of his heavy coat. Beneath it, he wore a wool shirt that had been red once but had faded to a dusty pink. His arms, exposed when he rolled up the sleeves to tend the fire, were thick with muscle and marked with scars. A man didn't live alone in the mountains for 15 years without collecting scars. Some from animals, some from accidents, one from a knife fight with a claim jumper, back when he was young and stupid and thought violence solved problems. He'd killed that man, the only man he'd ever killed, and the memory still sat in his gut like a stone. He rekindled the fire and put a pot of water on to boil. His stores were running low. He had maybe a week's worth of salt left, not enough to cure meat if he brought down a deer. His ammunition was down to 15 rounds for the Winchester and maybe 20 for his Colt revolver. He hadn't been to town in 6 months, not since last summer when he'd gone down to sell furs and buy supplies. He hated going to town, hated the noise, the crowds, the way people looked at him like he was some kind of wild thing that had wandered down from the high country. But necessity was necessity, and he was out of salt. He ate a cold breakfast of cornbread and salt pork, then went back outside to prepare for the journey. His horse, a sturdy Tennessee Walker mare named Ash, waited in the small lean-to he'd built behind the cabin. She was black as her name suggested, 8 years old, calm and reliable as the sunrise. He'd raised her from a foal, and she was probably the closest thing he had to a friend these days. He saddled her carefully, checking every strap and buckle. The trip down to Harlan would take 3 hours through snow and ice, and the last thing he needed was to have a saddle slip on a steep grade. He filled his canteen from the barrel of water by the door, made sure his knife was secure in its sheath at his belt, and climbed into the saddle. Ash snorted once, her breath steaming in the cold air, then started down the mountain trail without needing to be urged. The path down was treacherous, winding between rock outcroppings and stands of timber, crossing half-frozen streams and skirting ledges where a misstep would mean a 100-foot fall onto stones and shattered trees. Ezra let Ash pick her own way, trusting her mountain sense more than his own sometimes. They'd been making this journey together for 8 years. She knew every rock, every dangerous spot, every place where the trail narrowed to barely wider than her shoulders. About an hour down, they met another traveler coming up. Old Jedediah Potter, driving a wagon loaded with split firewood. His ancient mule plodding along with the resigned patience of an animal that had long ago given up expecting life to get any easier. Jedediah was somewhere north of 60, with a beard even longer than Ezra's, though his was white as the snow around them. He pulled his wagon to a stop when he saw Ezra, raising one gnarled hand in greeting. Ezra stopped Ash beside the wagon. He and Jedediah weren't exactly friends, but they had the kind of relationship mountain men often had, built on mutual respect and very few words. Jedediah looked up at him with eyes that had seen more winters than Ezra had been alive. His voice when he spoke was rough as tree bark. Ezra Blackwood. Been a while, Ezra nodded. Jedediah. Wood selling well? Well enough for folks who got money. Times is hard since the war ended. They sat in silence for a moment, two men who understood that not every silence needed to be filled. Then Jedediah shifted on his seat, and his face took on an expression Ezra couldn't quite read. Something between disgust and resignation. You headed down to Harlan? Jedediah asked. Ezra nodded again. Need salt and ammunition. Jedediah spat over the side of his wagon, a long brown stream of tobacco juice that steamed when it hit the snow. You might want to think twice about going today. Why's that? Jedediah's jaw worked on his chew for a moment before he answered. They're selling sinners down at the old tobacco warehouse. That's what they call it anyway. Redemption House is running another one of their auctions. Ezra felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. What kind of auction? The kind where they sell young women like they was livestock. Girls from that convent up in Nashville that burned down. They're calling it redemption, saying these girls need to work off their sins. But everybody knows it's just slavery dressed up in church clothes. Had one last month too. Sold 4 girls to miners and farmers. Lord knows what happened to them after. Ezra's hands tightened on the reins, and Ash shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. How many girls? Jedediah shrugged. Heard tell they got 9 from the convent. Sold 8 already. Got 1 left today. Last one, they say. After that, Redemption House is moving on to Tennessee or Virginia or someplace else where the law ain't caught up with them yet. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't comfortable. The wind moved through the pines, making them whisper secrets to each other. Somewhere far off, a crow called, harsh and lonely. I ain't telling you what to do, Jedediah said finally. But I seen your face, Ezra Blackwood, and I know that look. Just remember, Silas Crow runs Redemption House, and he's got the local law in his pocket. Sheriff Barton won't lift a finger to help if you cause trouble. And Crow's got men, hard men who don't mind hurting folks. Ezra looked down at the old man. Appreciate the warning. Jedediah studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You're going anyway, ain't you? Ezra didn't answer. He touched the brim of his hat, urged Ash forward, and continued down the mountain. Behind him, he heard Jedediah spit again and mutter something that might have been a prayer, or might have been a curse. The words followed Ezra down the trail like ghosts. They're selling sinners, girls from the convent. Last one today. The memories came uninvited, the way they always did when he thought about people being bought and sold. He was 12 years old again, standing in the yard of his father's failing farm in the valley below these very mountains. His father, a hard man made harder by poverty and whiskey, had been in debt to the owner of the coal mine down in the valley. $300, an impossible sum. The mine owner had offered a solution. He'd take Ezra as payment, $50 against the debt. A boy to work in the mines, to crawl through spaces too small for grown men, to breathe coal dust and darkness for 12 hours a day. His father had taken the deal without even looking at him. Ezra had worked in those mines for 3 years. 3 years of darkness and in danger, of watching boys younger than him die in cave-ins and explosions, of eating slop that wouldn't be fit for pigs and sleeping in a bunkhouse where the cold came up through the floor and the rats were bold enough to bite. At 15, he'd escaped during a thunderstorm, running through the woods while the mine guards searched for him with dogs and guns. He'd made it to these mountains and never come down again. Not for years. He'd taught himself to hunt, to trap, to survive on nothing but what the land provided. And he'd sworn in those early years of freedom that he would never stand by and watch another human being be bought and sold. Not if he could stop it. The town of Harlan sat in a valley where 3 creeks came together, a collection of rough wooden buildings that had sprung up around the coal mines and the timber operations. Maybe 800 people called it home, most of them miners or their families, along with the usual assortment of merchants and saloon keepers and those who made their living off the hard work of others. It was an ugly town, Ezra thought, all mud and coal dust and the smell of too many people living too close together. He'd never understood why folks wanted to live like this, all crowded in on each other, when there were mountains full of clean air and solitude just a few hours right away. But people were strange creatures, and their choices weren't his to judge. He rode Ash down the main street, which wasn't much more than a wide dirt track churned to frozen mud by wagon wheels and foot traffic. The few people he passed gave him a wide berth. He was used to that. He was a big man, bigger than most, and he looked like exactly what he was, something wild that had wandered down from the high places. Children stared at him with wide eyes. Women pulled their shawls tighter and hurried past. Men gave him hard looks but didn't meet his eyes for long. At the general store, he tied Ash to the hitching rail and went inside. The store was warm, heated by a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, and it smelled of coffee and tobacco and the particular mixture of goods that all general stores seemed to smell of. McAllister, the owner, was behind the counter, a thin man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on his nose. He looked up when Ezra entered, and his expression went from neutral to wary. "Ezra Blackwood," McAllister said. "It's been a while." Ezra nodded, moving to the counter. "Need 10 pounds of salt and 100 rounds of .44 rimfire." McAllister started gathering the items without comment. He was one of the few people in town who didn't try to make conversation with Ezra, which was one of the reasons Ezra did business with him. But today McAllister seemed nervous, his movements jerky, his eyes darting to the door and back. When he set the wrapped package of salt on the counter, he leaned in close and lowered his voice. You should get what you need and head back up the mountain, Ezra. Today's not a good day to be in town. So I heard, Ezra said. Jedediah told me about the auction. McAllister's face tightened. It's an evil thing, what they're doing. But Sheriff Barton says it's legal, and most folks are too scared of Silas Crow to speak against it. The girl they got today, she's just a child, really. Can't be more than 19 or 20. Been kept in that warehouse for 2 days without food, from what I hear. They're saying she's the last one, and then Redemption House is moving on. Good riddance, I say, but that doesn't help the poor girl they got locked up right now. Ezra said nothing. He paid for his supplies, counting out coins that he'd earned selling furs and hides. As he turned to leave, he heard it, a woman's voice, distant but clear, carrying through the cold air from somewhere down the street. A single word repeated over and over. No, no, no. The sound cut through him like a knife. It was the sound of desperation, of someone who'd been pushed past fear into something darker and more final. Ezra stopped in the doorway of the general store, his hand on the frame. McAllister was saying something behind him, some warning probably, but Ezra didn't hear it. He was 12 years old again, standing in his father's yard, wanting to scream, no, but not daring to because he knew it wouldn't matter. Except this time he wasn't 12. This time he could do something about it. He left his supplies on the counter and walked back out into the cold. The tobacco warehouse where Redemption House conducted its business stood about 200 yards down the street, a large wooden structure that had been built to store tobacco during harvest season, but now stood mostly empty since the war had destroyed the tobacco market. The voice was coming from there. Ezra walked toward it. His hand dropped to the Colt revolver at his hip, not drawing it, but just resting there, feeling the familiar weight and shape. People were gathering outside the warehouse, drawn by the sound of the woman's voice, but no one was doing anything. They just stood and watched, the way people always seemed to watch when something terrible was happening, too afraid or too compliant to intervene. Ezra pushed through the small crowd to the warehouse door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the warehouse was dim and cold, lit only by a few oil lamps hanging from the rafters. The space was mostly empty except for some old crates and barrels stacked against one wall. In the center of the floor, 3 men were trying to drag a young woman toward a wagon that waited by the loading dock. The woman was fighting them with everything she had, but she was small and they were large, and it was only a matter of time before they overpowered her completely. The woman wore what had once been a nun's habit, though it was torn and filthy now. Her hair, what Ezra could see of it, was a copper red, cut short in the style of religious sisters. Her face was pale except for a purple bruise on her left cheek and angry red marks on her wrists where rough rope had rubbed her skin raw. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, and she was fighting 3 men who together probably weighed 600. One of the men, a tall fellow with a thin mustache and expensive clothes that marked him as someone important, had her by the arm and was trying to twist it behind her back. Another man, shorter and heavy-set, had grabbed her other arm. The third man, the largest of the 3, was trying to get a grip on her legs, which she was using to kick at anything within reach. Ezra didn't announce himself, didn't call out a warning or ask what was happening. He simply walked up behind the tall man with the mustache, grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around and hit him once, hard, right on the point of his jaw. It was a punch that had 200 pounds of mountain muscle behind it, and it lifted the tall man off his feet and sent him sprawling backward into a stack of crates. The other 2 men froze, suddenly realizing there was someone else in the warehouse. The woman took advantage of their distraction. She yanked her arm free from the heavy-set man and drove her elbow into his stomach with surprising force. He doubled over, wheezing. The large man released her legs and stepped back, his hand moving towards something at his belt. A knife, Ezra saw. He drew his Colt with a speed that came from years of practice. The revolver cleared leather and came level with the large man's chest in less than a second. The man froze, his hand halfway to his knife. I wouldn't, Ezra said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the cold warehouse. The large man looked at the gun, then at Ezra's face. then slowly moved his hand away from the knife. The heavy-set man was still trying to catch his breath. The tall man with the mustache was groaning and trying to sit up, blood running from his split lip. The young woman had backed away from all of them, pressing herself against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Now that Ezra could see her properly, he realized she was even younger than he'd thought. 19 at most, maybe younger. Her eyes, wide-eyed and green as spring leaves, darted between Ezra and the three men, trying to understand what had just happened. The tall man finally managed to get to his feet, one hand pressed to his jaw. He looked at Ezra with eyes full of outrage and something else. Fear, maybe, though he was trying to hide it. "Do you know who I am?" the tall man demanded, his words slightly slurred from his split lip. "Do you know who you just struck?" Ezra looked at him with the same expression he might use when studying a snake he'd found in his cabin. "Don't know and don't care. Let the girl go." The tall man's face flushed red. "I'm Dalton Hargrave. My father owns half the coal mine is in this county. This girl is property of Redemption House, legally purchased and paid for. You've just assaulted me and interfered with legitimate business." Ezra's expression didn't change. "Buying people stopped at being legitimate business when we fought a war over it." "This is different," Dalton snapped. "These are sinners, fallen women who need redemption. Redemption House provides that redemption through honest work and Christian guidance." Ezra looked past Dalton at the young woman. She looked back at him, and he saw intelligence in those green eyes, along with exhaustion and fear and a stubborn kind of courage that reminded him of a fox he'd once seen caught in a trap, still fighting even though it knew it was probably going to die. "You feel like a sinner, miss?" he asked her. Her voice, when she spoke, surprised him. It was clear and strong despite the situation, marked with an Irish lilt that spoke of immigrant parents or perhaps being born in Ireland itself. "I was a novice at St. Agnes Convent in Nashville. We took in orphans and taught children to read. Then these men burned our convent, killed our Mother Superior, and kidnapped 9 of us. They've sold 8 of my sisters already. I'm the last. I don't know what sin that is, but it's not mine." The conviction in her voice, the absolute clarity of it, hit Ezra harder than he'd expected. Dalton Hargrave started to speak, probably to argue, but Ezra cut him off with a gesture of the Colt. "Get out," he said. "You can't just demand I leave," Dalton protested. "I have legal documents. I have rights. Silas Crow will have the law on you before sundown." Ezra took one step forward. It was amazing how much meaning could be packed into a single step when you were 6'3" and holding a gun. Dalton took 2 steps back. So did the other 2 men. "Get out," Ezra repeated. "All 3 of you. Now." They went. Dalton was still protesting as he reached the door, still threatening legal action and consequences, but he went. The other 2 followed him, and then Ezra and the young woman were alone in the warehouse. The silence felt heavy after all the shouting and struggling. Ezra kept the Colt out but lowered it, not wanting to point it anywhere near the girl. She was still pressed against the wall, watching him with those intelligent green eyes. Up close, he could see that she was shivering, whether from cold or shock or both he couldn't tell. Her wrists were raw and bleeding where the ropes had cut into them. Her feet were bare, he realized, on the frozen floor of the warehouse. She'd been dragged here without even being given shoes. Slowly, so as not to startle her, Ezra holstered the Colt. Then he shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out toward her. She didn't move, didn't reach for the coat, just kept watching him with those wary eyes. He understood. She'd just been rescued by a large, armed stranger who looked like he might eat raw meat for breakfast. For all she knew, he was just a different kind of danger than the 3 men who'd been trying to drag her to that wagon. "My name is Ezra Blackwood," he said quietly. "I live up on Pine Mountain. I'm not going to hurt you, miss, but you're cold and you're hurt, and this coat will help with at least one of those things." She studied him for another long moment, then slowly reached out and took the coat. It was far too large for her, hanging nearly to the floor, but it was thick and lined with fur and still warm from his body heat. She pulled it around herself with something like desperation, her thin fingers clutching the collar close to her throat. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "You don't know me." Ezra was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. "Because no one should be chained up and sold like an animal," he said finally. no matter what someone calls it. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. The lie, maybe, or the trick, or the real reason. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to at least partially find it, because some of the tension went out of her shoulders. They told us we were sinners, she said, that we needed to be redeemed through servitude, that it was God's will. But God wouldn't want this, would he? Ezra had stopped believing in God the day he buried his wife and son, but he wasn't about to tell this girl that. I don't know what God wants, he said, but I know what's right, and this isn't it. She took a shaky breath, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her back and lifted her chin, and he saw the steel under the exhaustion. My name is Catherine O'Brien, she said. Sister Catherine. They called me at the convent, but I suppose I'm not a sister anymore. Just Catherine. Or Kate, if you prefer. Kate, then, Ezra said. Can you walk? She looked down at her bare, bleeding feet, then back up at him. I can walk. I've walked worse. He believed her. There was something in her eyes that said she'd survived things that would have broken softer people. We need to get you out of here before those men come back with reinforcements. Are you hurt anywhere else besides your wrists and feet? Just bruises, she said. Nothing that won't heal. Ezra nodded and started toward the door. Kate followed, limping slightly but keeping up. When they reached the door, he stopped and looked out carefully. The small crowd that had gathered was dispersing now that the interesting part seemed to be over. No sign of Dalton Hargrave or his two companions, but that wouldn't last long. They stepped out into the cold, and Ezra led the way back toward the general store. People stared at them as they passed, the huge mountain man and the tiny young woman swimming in his coat. Ezra ignored the stares. He'd been ignored and stared at for most of his life. He was used to it. At the general store, McAllister took one look at them and immediately went to his back room, returning with a blanket and a pair of women's shoes that looked like they might have belonged to his wife. For the girl, McAllister said, holding them out. Can't have her walking around barefoot in December. Kate took the shoes gratefully. They were too big, but they were better than nothing. She sat down on a chair McAllister provided and put them on with hands that shook slightly. McAllister disappeared again and came back with bread and cheese and a cup of water. The girl fell on the food like someone who hadn't eaten in days, which she probably hadn't. Ezra had seen that kind of hunger before, in the mining camps when he was a boy. The hunger that comes from being deliberately starved, used as one more method of breaking someone's will. Slow down, he said gently. You eat too fast and you'll make yourself sick. She tried to slow down, but her body wasn't listening. She tore into the bread and cheese, washing it down with gulps of water. When she was done, she sat back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. A little color had come back into her cheeks. Thank you, she said to McAllister. And to you, she added, looking at Ezra. I don't know how to repay you. Don't need repaying, Ezra said. McAllister, can you do me a favor? McAllister, who'd been standing behind his counter looking concerned, nodded. What do you need? Can you get word to Sheriff Wade over in Lexington? Tell him Ezra Blackwood needs his help. Tell him it's about Redemption House. Wade will come, McAllister said. He's a good man, not like Barton. But it'll take time. He's 2 days' ride from here. Tell him to come as fast as he can, Ezra said. Then he looked at Kate. Can you ride a horse? I grew up on a farm in County Cork before we came to America, she said. I can ride. Good, we're leaving. Now, before Dalton Hargrave comes back with whatever passes for law in this town. They left the general store, Ezra carrying his supplies and Kate wearing McAllister's wife's 2 large shoes and Ezra's enormous coat. The sun was already starting to sink toward the western peaks. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, not nearly enough to make it back to his cabin, but enough to get well away from Harlan. He untied Ash from the hitching rail and helped Kate up into the saddle. She settled herself with the ease of someone who'd told the truth about knowing how to ride. Ezra swung up behind her, and they started back the way he'd come that morning. Behind them, Harlan receded into the gathering dusk, and Ezra didn't look back. The mountain trail was harder to navigate with 2 people on 1 horse, even a strong horse like Ash. They moved slowly, carefully, Ezra letting the mare pick her way over the icy patches and around the dangerous spots. Kate sat silent in front of him, so still he might have thought she'd fallen asleep except for the tension he could feel in her shoulders. After about an hour, as they were passing through a thick stand of pines, she finally spoke. "Why did you really help me?" she asked. "The truth this time." Ezra thought about his answer for a while. The trail was steep here, requiring his concentration, but her question deserved more than a quick reply. "When I was 12 years old," he said finally, "my father sold me to a coal mine owner. $50 against a debt. I worked in those mines for 3 years. Came out at 15 looking like I was 30 and feeling like I was 100. Took me years to stop flinching when I heard a loud noise. Because in the mines, loud noises usually meant the ceiling was coming down and you were about to die. So when I see someone being bought and sold, I remember being 12 and wanting someone, anyone, to step in and say it was wrong. No one did, but maybe I can." He felt her relax slightly, settling back against him just a fraction. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said. "And I'm sorry for what happened to you," he replied. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when two people have shared something true about themselves and found understanding in it. As the sun touched the peaks and turned the snow golden orange, as the temperature dropped and their breath made clouds in the air, they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the world of buying and selling behind them, at least for now. Darkness fell fast in the mountains during December, dropping like a curtain across the narrow valleys and steep ridges. Ezra had known they wouldn't make it back to his cabin before nightfall, but he'd hoped to get further than they had. The trail became treacherous once the sun disappeared, shadows pooling in places where ice lurked, waiting to send horse and riders tumbling down into ravines where no one would find them until spring. When they reached a small clearing beside a frozen creek, Ezra made the decision to stop for the night. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He helped Kate down from the saddle first, then dismounted himself. His legs were stiff from the cold and from sitting in one position for so long. Kate immediately wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the heavy coat. The temperature was dropping fast now, probably down to 10 degrees already and heading lower. They needed shelter and they needed fire, and they needed both quickly. "There's a rock overhang about 50 yards up the creek," Ezra said, his breath making clouds in the air. "Used to camp there when I was younger. Not much, but it'll keep the wind off and reflect the heat from a fire." "Can you walk?" Kate nodded, though her teeth were chattering. "I can walk." He took Ash's reins and led the way upstream, following a path he hadn't walked in years, but still remembered. The rock overhang was where he'd left it, a shelf of limestone that jutted out about 8 feet, creating a space underneath that was maybe 10 feet deep and 12 feet wide. Not quite a cave, but close enough. The ground underneath was relatively dry, covered in old pine needles and the remains of fires from years past. Someone else had used this spot too, probably trappers or hunters passing through. Ezra tied Ash to a nearby pine where she'd have some shelter from the wind, then set about making camp. He'd done this 1,000 times, could do it half asleep or sick or injured. First the fire. He gathered deadfall from under the pines where it had stayed relatively dry, breaking branches into manageable sizes. Kate watched him work, still shivering, still wrapped in his coat. When he had enough wood, he used his knife to shave fine curls of wood from a piece of pine, creating tinder that would catch from a spark. His fire-starting kit was in his pack, a small tin containing char cloth, flint, and steel. Within minutes, he had a small flame going, feeding it carefully until it grew strong enough to accept larger pieces of wood. The fire transformed the space under the overhang. The flickering orange light pushed back the darkness and the cold, reflecting off the limestone above them and creating a pocket of warmth in the frozen night. Ezra added more wood until the fire was burning hot and steady, then turned his attention to making the camp more comfortable. He spread his bedroll near the fire, but not too close, then gestured for Kate to sit. She did, sinking down onto the blankets with a small sound that might have been relief or exhaustion, or both. Up close in the firelight, Ezra could see just how young she really was. 19, she'd said, but she looked younger, her face all sharp angles and shadowed hollows from too many days without enough food. The bruise on her cheek was darker now, purple spreading toward black, and there were other bruises on her throat that he hadn't noticed before. Fingerprints, he realized, where someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. The sight made something cold and angry settle in his chest. He retrieved his canteen and the supplies he'd bought that morning from his pack. The salt pork and cornbread he'd brought for the journey would have to serve as dinner. He handed Kate a piece of the cornbread and some of the dried meat. She took it, but didn't eat right away, just held it in her hands and stared at the fire. "You should eat," Ezra said. "It's not much, but it'll give you strength." "I know," she said quietly. "It's just strange. This morning I thought I was going to be sold to some miner or farmer who'd use me however he wanted. Tonight I'm sitting by a fire in the mountains with a man who asks if I can walk instead of just dragging me where he wants me to go. It doesn't feel real." Ezra settled himself on the other side of the fire, giving her space, not wanting to crowd her. "It's real," he said. "You're safe, at least for now." She looked up at him then, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "For now," she repeated, "but not forever. They'll come looking for me. Redemption House won't just let me go. They paid for me." $300, I heard Silas Crow say. "That's a lot of money to just write off." Ezra nodded. He'd been thinking about the same thing. "You're right, they'll come. Probably tomorrow or the day after, which is why we need to get you somewhere safe and get the law involved. Real law, not whatever Sheriff Barton represents." "Real law," Kate said, and there was something bitter in her voice. "The law says we owe Redemption House 7 years of service to redeem our sins. The law says we signed contracts. Never mind that we were locked in a room and told to sign papers we weren't allowed to read, or that they'd kill us if we refused. The law doesn't care about that part." It was a fair point, and Ezra didn't have a good answer for it. Instead, he changed the subject slightly. "Tell me about the convent, about what happened." Kate was quiet for a long moment, and Ezra thought she might refuse. Then she started talking, her voice low and steady, staring into the fire as she spoke. "St. Agnes was a small convent in Nashville. We took in orphans, mostly Irish children whose parents had died on the journey to America or died from disease after they arrived. We taught them to read and write, gave them a safe place to grow up. I came there when I was 5, after my parents died of cholera. Mother Superior Mary took me in, raised me like her own daughter. When I was 15, I began my novitiate. I thought I'd spend my life there, teaching children, living quietly. It seemed like a good life." She paused, and Ezra saw her hands tighten on the cornbread she still hadn't eaten. "Then 3 months ago, in September, men came in the night. They said there had been complaints about the convent, that we were harboring runaway slaves, which was a lie. They set fire to the building. Mother Superior's Mary tried to stop them, tried to protect us. They shot her, just shot her right in front of us, and left her there to die in the fire. They took 9 of us, the youngest sisters, and locked us in a wagon. We didn't know where we were going. They kept us in a tobacco warehouse for 2 weeks, barely feeding us, telling us we were sinners who needed redemption through hard work and obedience." "How many of you were there originally?" Ezra asked. 9, Kate said. "They sold the first girl in October to a mine owner in Virginia, then another to a farmer in Tennessee, then more and more. Some of the men who bought them seemed almost decent, like maybe they really believed they were helping us. Others looked at us like we were cattle they were buying at market. By yesterday, I was the only one left. I tried to run twice. They caught me both times and beat me for it. Today was supposed to be the last auction. After they sold me, Redemption House was going to move on to Kentucky or Ohio and start over with new girls." Ezra felt that cold anger in his chest grow colder. "Where are the other 8 now? I don't know," Kate said, and her voice cracked slightly. "Scattered across 3 states, I suppose. Working for men who think they own us. Some of them might be treated well. Others," she trailed off, but Ezra could imagine what she wasn't saying. "You have to understand," she continued, "we weren't prepared for this. We were sheltered, innocent. Most of us had never been more than 10 miles from the convent. We knew how to pray and teach children and tend gardens. We didn't know how to fight or run or survive. They picked us because we'd be easy to control." "But you ran anyway," Ezra observed. "Twice." A ghost of a smile crossed Kate's face. "I'm stubborn. My mother used to say I had more stubbornness than sense. Mother Superior Mary said the same thing, though she said it fondly. I wasn't going to just accept what they were doing to us. Even if running meant getting beaten, I had to try." "Stubbornness isn't a sin," Ezra said. "It's survival." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling and popping as pitch in the wood ignited. Finally, Kate began eating the cornbread and salt pork, slowly this time, taking small bites and chewing carefully. Ezra watched the darkness beyond the firelight, listening for sounds that didn't belong, the snap of a branch or the whinny of a horse that wasn't Ash. But there was nothing except the wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl hunting in the frozen night. "Can I ask you something?" Kate said after a while. "You can ask," Ezra replied. "Can't promise I'll answer. The two graves by your cabin. Your wife and child?" Ezra felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when he thought about Rebecca and Daniel. "Yes," he said. "Scarlet fever, 5 years ago. Daniel got sick first. Rebecca caught it taking care of him. They died within 3 days of each other." "I'm sorry," Kate said, and there was genuine compassion in her voice. "That must have been terrible beyond words." "It was," Ezra said simply. "For a long time after I wished I'd died too. Took me a year or more to start wanting to live again. Some days I'm still not sure I do." "But you saved me today," Kate pointed out. "A man who doesn't want to live doesn't risk his life for a stranger." Ezra thought about that. "Maybe," he said finally, "or maybe saving you was easier than saving myself." Before Kate could respond to that, they heard it. The sound of horses moving through the forest. Multiple horses, coming from the direction of the trail they'd left. Ezra was on his feet instantly, his hand on the colt at his hip. He moved to the edge of the overhang, staying in shadow, and looked down toward the creek. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving slowly through the trees, lanterns held high, looking for something. Looking for them. Kate had risen too, her face pale in the firelight. "Is it them?" she whispered. Ezra nodded. He could make out faces now in the lantern light. Dalton Hargrave was one of them, his jaw still swollen from where Ezra had hit him that afternoon. The other 3 were rough-looking men, the kind you could hire for dirty work if you paid them enough. They hadn't spotted the campfire yet, but they would soon. The overhang concealed them somewhat, but firelight was visible from a distance in the darkness. Ezra made a quick decision. He turned to Kate. "There's a path behind this overhang that leads up to a higher ridge. Can you climb in the dark?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Take Ash and go. Keep climbing until you reach the top of the ridge, then follow it north. You'll come to a larger trail eventually. Follow that trail east and it'll take you to my cabin." "The door isn't locked." "What about you?" Kate asked. "I'm going to give them something else to think about besides chasing you," Ezra said. "Now go, quickly and quietly." She hesitated for just a moment, long enough to look him in the eyes. "Don't die," she said. "I've had enough death for one lifetime." Then she was moving, leading Ash away from the firelight and up the narrow path that wound behind the rock face. Ezra waited until he couldn't hear her anymore, then turned his attention back to the men below. They were closer now, close enough that he could hear their voices. "That's smoke," one of them was saying. "Campfire smoke. They're up ahead somewhere, down." Dalton's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "When we find them, I want the mountain man." "Nobody makes a fool of Dalton Hargrave and lives to tell about it. The girl we take back to Silas. He'll handle her." Ezra felt the cold anger in his chest turn hot. He'd seen enough of men like Dalton in his life. Men who thought their money or their name gave them the right to do whatever they wanted to, whoever they wanted. He'd worked for men like that in the mines, been beaten by them, watched them work children to death and not care. He hadn't been able to stop them then, but he could stop this one now. He picked up a burning branch from the fire and hurled it down toward the riders. It landed in the snow with a hiss and a spray of sparks, startling the horses and causing the men to pull up short. "Up here," Ezra called down to them. "You want me, Hargrave? Come and get me." There was a moment of confused shouting, then the crack of a gunshot. The bullet whined off the rock face 20 feet to Ezra's left, nowhere close. Ezra drew his Colt, aimed carefully at the lantern Dalton was holding, and fired. The lantern exploded in a spray of burning oil, and Dalton's horse reared and screamed. Dalton hit the ground hard, and his horse bolted back down the trail with Dalton's boots still caught in the stirrup. He managed to kick free and roll into the snow, cursing loudly enough to make a sailor blush. The other 3 men had dismounted and were using their horses as cover, returning fire now. Bullets chipped at the limestone above Ezra's head, and he ducked back into better cover. He wasn't trying to kill anyone, just slow them down, give Kate more time to get away. He fired twice more, both shots aimed at the ground near the men's feet, sending up sprays of snow and frozen earth. They'd be more cautious now, more careful, which meant more time. "You're a dead man, Blackwood," Dalton shouted from somewhere in the darkness. "You hear me?" "Dead." Ezra didn't bother responding. He ejected the spent shells from his Colt and reloaded, counting rounds in his head. He'd brought 20 rounds for the revolver, had fired 3, which left him 17. Not much if this turned into a prolonged fight. He needed to break contact and follow Kate up the mountain. He fired once more, making them keep their heads down, then grabbed his pack and bedroll and moved quickly to the path Kate had taken. The path was narrow and steep, more of a game trail than anything humans would normally use. It wound up through a crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a man of Ezra's size. He had to turn sideways in places, his pack scraping against stone on both sides. Behind him, he could hear the men reaching the overhang, shouting when they found the camp empty. "The fire's still hot," one of them called. "He can't be far." "Split up," Dalton ordered. "2 of you follow the trail north. Me and Cole will go up." He's got to be going up. Ezra climbed faster, his lungs burning in the cold air. The path seemed to go on forever, winding back and forth across the rock face like a snake. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 15 minutes, he emerged onto the higher ridge. The wind hit him like a physical force up here, strong enough to make him stagger. He could see for miles in every direction, the mountains rolling away in waves of darkness under a sky full of hard, bright stars. And there, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, moving steadily north and along the ridge, was a darker shadow that had to be Kate with Ash. Ezra started after her, moving as quickly as he dared on the icy ridge. The wind covered the sound of his movement, but it also covered the sounds of anyone following him. He kept glancing back, expecting to see Dalton and the one called Cole emerge from the path behind him, but there was nothing. Maybe they'd given up, decided it wasn't worth freezing to death in the mountains in December. Or maybe they were being smart, moving slowly and carefully, taking their time. Behind him, back down in the valley, he could see the tiny points of light that were the searchers' lanterns, moving along the creek. They'd probably follow the main trail, thinking that's where their quarry had gone. By the time they realized their mistake, Ezra and Kate would be long gone. He caught up to Kate about 20 minutes later. She'd stopped to let Ash rest, standing in the lee of a large boulder that gave some shelter from the wind. When she saw Ezra approaching, relief washed across her face. "You're alive," she said. "Hard to kill," Ezra replied. "How are you holding up?" "Cold," she admitted. "Tired. But I can keep going if I need to." "We need to," Ezra said. "My cabin is still about 2 hours from here, maybe 3 in the dark. But once we're there, we'll be safe for a while. It's not easy to find if you don't know where to look." They continued north along the ridge, Ezra leading Ash now, Kate walking beside the horse to stay out of the worst of the wind. The temperature continued to drop, and Ezra's beard was soon stiff with ice from his frozen breath. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, and he couldn't feel his toes anymore. Kate had to be even colder, but she didn't complain, just kept putting one foot in front of the other with the same stubborn determination she'd shown all day. The stars wheeled slowly overhead as they walked, Orion rising in the east, the Big Dipper pointing the way north. Ezra had navigated by these stars more times than he could count, in all seasons and all weather. They were as familiar to him as old friends, more reliable than most people he'd known. After about an hour, the ridge began to descend, dropping down into a narrow valley where 3 smaller ridges came together. This was familiar territory now. Ezra knew every tree, every rock, every turn in the trail. They were close. His cabin sat in a hollow protected on 3 sides by steep slopes, invisible from any angle until you were almost on top of it. The kind of place a man could live for years without anyone knowing he was there, which was exactly why Ezra had built it here. As they came around the last bend in the trail, the cabin appeared, a dark bulk against the snow, with the 2 stone cairns marking the graves nearby. Ezra felt something loosen in his chest. They'd made it. He led Ash to the lean-to behind the cabin and unsaddled her, rubbing her down with handfuls of dry straw and making sure she had hay and water. The mare had earned her rest tonight. Then he and Kate went to the cabin door. It opened with a familiar creak, and the smell of his home washed over him, wood smoke and cured meat, and that particular scent of a place where someone has lived alone for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals in the hours since he'd left that morning, but the cabin was still warmer than outside. Ezra rekindled the fire, feeding it carefully until it blazed up again, filling the small space with light and heat. Kate stood just inside the door, looking around at the sparse furnishings, the rough wooden table and chairs, the bed in the corner, the shelves holding his few possessions. "It's not much," Ezra said, "but it's warm and it's dry and it's safe. It's more than I had this morning," Kate said. "This morning I had nothing but fear and despair. Now I have this," she gestured around the cabin, "and I have hope. That's more than enough." Ezra felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest at her words. He wasn't used to gratitude, wasn't sure what to do with it. "You should sleep," he said, gesturing to the bed. "Take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor nearest the fire." Kate looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She made her way to the bed and sat down on the edge, her movements slow and careful, like someone much older. Ezra turned his back to give her privacy while she removed the two large shoes and arranged herself under the blankets. When he heard the creak of the rope mattress settle, he glanced over. She was already asleep, or close to it, her red hair dark against the pillow, one hand curled under her chin like a child. He spread his bedroll on the floor near the fireplace and sat down, his back against the wall, the Colt within easy reach. He should sleep too, he knew. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but he found himself unable to close his eyes, his mind too full of the day's events, of the young woman sleeping in his bed, of the men who would surely come looking for her. He'd broken the pattern of his life today, the careful solitude he'd maintained for 5 years. He'd let someone in, saved someone, brought them to his home, and now there would be consequences. There were always consequences. As if in answer to his thoughts, he heard it. The sound of a horse moving through the trees near the cabin. Just one horse, moving slowly, like the rider was being careful not to make noise. Ezra was on his feet in an instant, Colt in hand, moving to the door. He eased it open a crack and looked out into the darkness. The horse and rider emerged from the tree line, and Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger. Then he saw the rider's face in the starlight and relaxed slightly. It wasn't Dalton Hargrave or any of his men. It was a boy, couldn't be more than 10 or 11 years old, sitting on a horse far too large for him. The boy was swaying in the saddle, clearly exhausted, and as Ezra watched, he slid sideways and tumbled to the ground, landing in the snow with a soft thump. Ezra shoved the Colt back in its holster and ran out to where the boy had fallen. Up close, he could see that the child was in bad shape. His clothes were torn and bloody, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Ezra scooped him up, surprised by how light he was, nothing but skin and bones, and carried him quickly back to the cabin. Kate was awake now, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide. "What happened?" she asked. "Found him outside," Ezra said, laying the boy on the table. "He's hurt bad." Together they began examining the boy's injuries in the firelight. There was a deep gash across his forehead that had bled profusely but seemed to have stopped now. His left arm hung at an odd angle, probably broken. There were bruises everywhere, old and new, yellow and purple, and black, painting a story of repeated beatings over a long period of time. Worst of all, there were rope burns around his wrists and ankles, raw and infected. Someone had kept this child tied up. "Who could do this to a child?" Kate whispered, her hands gentle as she began cleaning the head wound with water Ezra heated over the fire. "Someone evil," Ezra said. He'd seen abuse before, had experienced it himself, but it never got easier to witness. He examined the broken arm carefully. It was a clean break at least, the kind that would heal if set properly. "We need to set this arm," he said to Kate. "It's going to hurt him. A lot." "I'll hold him," Kate said. "Do what you need to do." Ezra worked quickly, feeling along the bone until he found the break, then pulling and manipulating until he felt it slip back into place. The boy screamed, a high, thin sound that cut through the quiet cabin, then passed out from the pain. Ezra used strips of cloth and pieces of wood from his kindling pile to make a splint, binding it tightly. It wasn't perfect, but it would do until they could get the boy to a real doctor. They worked in silence for another hour, cleaning and bandaging wounds, making the boy as comfortable as possible. Finally, they laid him in the bed, covering him with blankets. His breathing had evened out, his face peaceful in sleep despite the injuries. "He'll live," Ezra said, "though whoever did this to him should pray we never meet." Kate looked at the sleeping boy, then at Ezra. "This is twice in one day you've saved someone. Is this what you do? Rescue people?" "No," Ezra said, "or at least I didn't used to. I used to just live here alone and try to forget the world existed. But today, it seems like the world won't let me forget." "Maybe that's good," Kate said softly. "Maybe you've been alone long enough." Ezra didn't have an answer for that. He stoked the fire again, adding wood to keep the cabin warm through the rest of the night. Kate curled up in one of the chairs, refusing to take the bed now that the boy needed it. Ezra tried to argue, but she had that stubborn look in her eyes again, and he recognized a losing battle when he saw one. He spread his bedroll on the floor and lay down, his body aching from the long day. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams of burning buildings and locked doors and the sound of chains rattling in darkness. He woke several times during the night, his hand reaching instinctively for his gun, but each time it was nothing. Just the wind in the trees, just the fire settling, just the normal sounds of a cabin in winter. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, turning it from black to gray to pale gold, Ezra lay awake and watched the light grow. In the bed, the boy slept on. In the chair, Kate was curled up with her head pillowed on her arms, her breathing deep and even. And outside, through the single window, Ezra could see the two graves marked by their cairns of stone, silent witnesses to all that had happened and all that was yet to come. He'd thought his life was finished 5 years ago when he buried Rebecca and Daniel. Thought he was just waiting out his days until he could join them. But now, looking at the sleeping boy and the exhausted woman, he wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe there was still work to be done. Maybe there were still people who needed saving. And maybe, just maybe, saving them might save him too. The boy woke with a scream just after dawn, his eyes flying open in terror, his good arm flailing as if trying to fight off an invisible attacker. Ezra was beside him in an instant, his large hands gentle but firm on the child's shoulders, holding him still before he could injure himself further. "Easy," Ezra said, his voice low and calm. "Easy, son, you're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you here." The boy's eyes darted around the cabin wildly, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings, the bearded giant holding him, the red-haired woman standing nearby with concern written across her features. "Where am I?" he gasped. "Where's Uncle Silas? Is he coming? Please don't let him find me." "Nobody named Silas is coming here," Ezra said. "You're on Pine Mountain in my cabin. My name is Ezra Blackwood. This is Miss Catherine. We found you collapsed outside last night. You were hurt pretty bad." The boy's breathing began to slow, though his eyes remained wide and frightened. Slowly, the panic seemed to drain out of him, replaced by exhaustion and pain. "My arm," he whispered. "It hurts." "It's broken," Ezra told him. "I said it best I could, but you'll need a proper doctor to look at it. Can you tell us your name?" The boy hesitated, as if even giving his name might be dangerous. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Samuel Hayes, but everyone calls me Sam." "Well, Sam," Kate said, moving closer with a cup of water, "how old are you?" 10, Sam said, though something in his eyes suggested he'd had to grow up much faster than that. "I'll be 11 in March, if I live that long." "You'll live," Ezra said with certainty. "Question is, what happened to... Who's this Uncle Silas you mentioned?" Sam's face crumpled, and tears began running down his cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt and dry blood. "He's not really my uncle. He's my father's brother. But Pa always said Silas was touched by the devil." Pa was right. After Pa died, Silas came and took me from our farm. Said I owed him money for Pa's debts. Said I had to work for him until the debt was paid. "How long ago was this?" Kate asked gently. 3 months, Sam said. "Feels like 3 years. He kept me in a root cellar, chained up when I wasn't working. Beat me when I was too slow or when he was drunk, which was most days. Yesterday he said he was taking me to Redemption House, said they'd pay good money for a boy who could work. I got away when we stopped to water the horses. Stole one of them and just rode. I didn't know where I was going. Just knew I had to get away." At the mention of Redemption House, Ezra and Kate exchanged glances. The same people, Kate said quietly. The same evil. You know about Redemption House? Sam asked, his eyes widening. We know, Ezra said grimly. And we know about Silas Crow, who runs it. Different Silas than your uncle, I'm guessing, but cut from the same cloth. Bad men doing bad things and calling it righteous. Sam started to sit up, then gasped and fell back as pain lanced through his broken arm. My uncle will come looking for me. He always said if I ran, he'd hunt me down and kill me. Said nobody would care about one dead orphan boy. Let him come, Ezra said, and there was steel in his voice. If he shows his face on my mountain, he'll learn what happens to men who hurt children. Kate brought over a bowl of porridge she'd made from Ezra's meager supplies, sweetened with a little honey. You need to eat, she told Sam. Keep your strength up. You're safe here with us. Sam took the bowl with his good hand and began eating slowly, as if he expected the food to be taken away at any moment. Between bites, he studied Ezra with curiosity that was starting to overcome his fear. You're awful big, he observed. Are you a giant like in the stories? Just a man, Ezra said. A man who doesn't like bullies. He saved me yesterday, Kate added. Saved me from the same people who were going to buy you. Your uncle was taking you to the same fate I escaped from. Sam looked at Kate with new interest. You were at Redemption House? I was going to be sold there, Kate said. Mr. Blackwood stopped it. Now we're both here, both safe. And so are you. For how long? Sam asked, and the question held more wisdom than a 10-year-old should possess. Uncle Silas has friends, mean friends. They'll come looking. Then we'll be ready, Ezra said. But first we need to get you properly healed and figure out what to do next. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the brightening morning. The snow had stopped during the night, and the world outside was pristine and white, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. He could see tracks in the snow near the tree line, deer probably, come down from the high country looking for food. And beyond them, nothing. No sign of pursuit. Yet. He turned back to find Kate watching him with those intelligent green eyes. We can't stay here forever, she said quietly. Can we? No, Ezra admitted. This is a good place to hide for a day or two, but that's all. We need help, real help. The law. You said Sheriff Barton was in Silas Crow's pocket, Kate pointed out. He is, Ezra agreed, but Sheriff Wade over in Lexington isn't. Marcus Wade is a good man, honest as they come. He and I served together during the war. If anyone can help us, it's him. Lexington is 2 days' ride from here, Kate said. Can you make it there and back before they find us? I'll have to, Ezra said. I'll leave this morning, ride hard, and be back as quick as I can. He looked at Sam. You'll stay here with Miss Catherine. Keep the door barred and the gun loaded. Anyone comes that you don't know, you hide in the root cellar I've got under the floorboards, and you don't come out until you hear my voice. Understand? Sam nodded solemnly. I understand, Mr. Blackwood. Just Ezra, he said. Mr. Blackwood was my father, and he wasn't worth the title. He began preparing for the journey, gathering supplies and ammunition, checking Ash's hooves and tack. Kate followed him outside, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. You're really going to help us, she said. A stranger and an orphan boy you don't even know. Ezra paused in his work, thinking about how to answer. Finally, he said, when I was Sam's age, I needed someone to help me. Nobody did. I spent 3 years in hell because nobody stepped in. I won't be nobody. Not anymore. Kate stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. You're a good man, Ezra Blackwood. Better than you think you are. I'm just a man who can't stand by and watch children suffer, he said. That doesn't make me good, just makes me someone who remembers. It makes you both, Kate said softly. Then she did something that surprised him. She stood on her toes and kissed his bearded cheek, quick and light as a bird landing. For luck, she said. Come back safe. Ezra felt heat rise in his face the first time he'd blushed in years. He touched his cheek where she'd kissed him, then nodded once and swung into the saddle. I'll be back, he said. 2 days, 3 at most. Keep Sam safe. Keep yourself safe. He rode down the mountain trail as the sun climbed higher, painting the snow with gold and shadow. The journey to Lexington would normally take 2 full days, but Ezra pushed Ash harder than he liked, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the mare. He traveled through country he knew well, over ridges and through valleys where he'd trapped and hunted for 15 years. The land was harsh in December, but it was honest in its harshness, unlike men who smiled while they sold children into bondage. He made good time, and by nightfall of the first day, he was already past the halfway point. He made a cold camp in a hollow tree, not risking a fire that might draw attention, and slept fitfully with his gun in his hand. His dreams were troubled, full of images of Kate and Sam surrounded by armed men, of the cabin burning, of arriving too late to save them. He woke before dawn, fed Ash the last of the grain he'd brought, and pressed on. Lexington appeared before him as the sun reached its zenith on the second day. A proper town with brick buildings and paved streets, so different from Harlan's rough timber and mud. He'd been here before, years ago, and the sight of civilization after so long in the mountains made him feel exposed and uncomfortable. But he pushed through the discomfort and made his way to the sheriff's office on Main Street. Marcus Wade was behind his desk when Ezra walked in, and the look of surprise on his face was almost comical. "Ezra Blackwood," Wade said, standing up with a grin. "As I live and breathe, I thought you'd become one with that mountain of yours by now." "Marcus," Ezra said, gripping the other man's hand. He'd aged in the 3 years since Ezra had last seen him, more gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes, but the grip was still firm and the eyes were still sharp. "I need your help. Must be serious to bring you down from on high," Wade said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit. Tell me everything." Ezra sat and told him about finding Kate at the auction, about Redemption House and Silas Crow, about Sam showing up beaten and broken, about the men who were surely hunting them even now. Wade listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Ezra finished, Wade was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he thought. "I've heard rumors about Redemption House," Wade said finally. "Nothing concrete enough to act on, but rumors. Human trafficking dressed up as redemption and salvation. The kind of thing that makes me ashamed to call myself a lawman, knowing it's happening and not being able to stop it." "Can you stop it now?" Ezra asked. Wade stood and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out papers and documents. "I can try. If what you're telling me is true, and I have no reason to doubt you, then Silas Crow and his operation are in violation of about a dozen laws. The trick is proving it. I'll need witnesses. I'll need evidence." "I can get you both," Ezra said. "The girl, Catherine, she was there. She saw everything. And there are others, 8 more girls, that Redemption House sold. If we can find them, get them to testify. That could take weeks," Wade said. "Maybe months. And in the meantime, what happens to the girl and the boy?" "Crow won't stop looking for them. If what you say is true about Sheriff Barton, then you've got the local law working against you too. Then we need to move fast," Ezra said. "Come back to Harlan with me. Bring deputies. We raid Redemption House, free anyone they've got locked up, and arrest Crow and his people before they can scatter." Wade considered this, then nodded slowly. "It's risky. If we go in without proper warrants, without following procedure, any case we build could fall apart in court. But if we don't go in, more people suffer." He made his decision, the kind of decision that separated good lawmen from bad ones. "I'll get a warrant from Judge Morrison. He's sympathetic to this sort of thing. And I'll bring 4 deputies, good men all of them. We leave at first light tomorrow." Ezra felt something loosen in his chest. "Thank you, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet," Wade said. "We've still got to pull this off without getting anyone killed. Now you look like you haven't eaten in 2 days. Come on, I'll buy you dinner and we can plan this properly." They spent the evening in Wade's office going over maps and strategy, planning the raid on Redemption House like it was a military operation. Wade's deputies arrived as they worked, 4 hard-faced men who listened carefully and asked smart questions. By the time they were done, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan, but a good one. They'd ride for Harlan the next morning, arrive after dark, and hit Redemption House before dawn. Fast and hard, giving Crow and his people no time to destroy evidence or harm anyone in their custody. Ezra slept that night in Wade's guest room, the first time he'd slept in a real bed in years that wasn't his own. It felt strange, soft, and confining after years of rope mattresses and bedrolls on hard ground. He lay awake for a long time, thinking about Kate and Sam back at the cabin, hoping they were safe, hoping he hadn't made a terrible mistake leaving them alone. Morning came cold and gray, with clouds promising more snow. Ezra and Wade's group rode out as the sun was still struggling to clear the horizon. 6 men on good horses, armed and determined. They pushed hard, making in one long day what had taken Ezra 2, arriving in the hills above Harlan just as darkness was falling. They made camp in a copse of pines about a mile from town, a cold camp with no fire to give away their position. From here they could see Harlan laid out below them, lights beginning to appear in windows as people lit lamps against the gathering dark. And there on the edge of town, a larger building that had to be Redemption House, its windows dark and unwelcoming. "We go in 3 hours before dawn," Wade said quietly. "That's when people sleep deepest. We'll have surprise on our side." "What if they've moved on already?" one of the deputies asked. "What if this Crow fellow got spooked and ran?" "Then we track him down," Wade said, "but I don't think he's run. Men like that, they think they're untouchable. They don't run until it's too late." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Ezra sat with his back against a pine tree, checking and rechecking his weapons, running through the plan in his head. Finally, Wade gave the signal, and they moved down the hill toward town, 6 shadows in the darkness, silent as hunting wolves. Redemption House was a converted tobacco warehouse, 2 stories of weathered wood with a few small barred windows. The front door was locked, but one of Wade's deputies was good with locks and had it open in less than a minute. They entered quietly, guns drawn, moving through the darkness by the light of shuttered lanterns. The ground floor was mostly empty, just storage in what looked like an office. But there were stairs leading up, and from above they could hear sounds, voices, crying. They climbed the stairs, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust that covered everything. At the top was a hallway with 3 doors. Wade pointed to his deputies, assigning them doors, then nodded. They hit all 3 doors simultaneously, bursting through with shouts of, "Sheriffs! Hands up!" The second held Silas Crow himself, a fat man in an expensive nightshirt, scrambling for a gun in his nightstand. One of the deputies had him on the ground and in handcuffs before he could reach it. But there was someone else in the room. A woman, middle-aged, dressed in a nun's habit that looked too fine, too expensive for a genuine sister. She stood by the window as if she'd been about to climb out when they burst in. "Who's this?" Wade demanded. "My wife," Silas spat. "Agatha, she has nothing to do with this." But Ezra had seen the papers on the nightstand, seen Agatha's signature on the ledgers. "She's part of it," Ezra said quietly. "Look at what she's wearing. That's not a real habit. She was pretending to be a reverend mother, wasn't she? Making the girls think they were still in church hands." Agatha's face went white. I was just helping my husband with his business." "Your business is slavery," Wade said coldly, and motioned to another deputy. "Take her too." But it was the third room that made Ezra's blood run cold. 12 girls, ranging in age from maybe 15 to 25, all chained to rings bolted into the floor. They were filthy, emaciated, some of them so broken they didn't even look up when the deputies entered. Others cowered, clearly expecting more abuse. "It's all right," Wade said, his voice gentle, despite the anger Ezra could see in his eyes. "We're here to help. You're safe now." It took an hour to free all the girls, to break the chains and begin the process of documenting what they found. Wade's deputies were thorough, gathering evidence, taking statements from those who could speak. Silas Crow was loud in his protests at first, claiming he had legal right to these girls, that they were indentured servants working off debts. But when Wade showed him the warrant and told him exactly what he was being charged with, Crow's bluster faded. He knew he was finished. They found records in Crow's office, meticulously kept books showing every girl he'd bought and sold over the past 2 years. 28 names in total, sold for prices ranging from $200 to $500 each. The evidence was damning, enough to put Crow away for the rest of his natural life. As dawn broke over Harlan, Wade and his deputies marched Silas Crow down Main Street in chains, the 12 freed girls following behind, wrapped in blankets the deputies had found. People came out of their homes to watch, and Ezra saw shame on many faces. They'd known or suspected and done nothing. Now they had to face what their silence had enabled. Sheriff Barton emerged from his office, his face red with anger. What's the meaning of this, Wade? You have no jurisdiction here. I have a warrant from Judge Morrison, and I have probable cause, Wade said calmly. And I have evidence of human trafficking on a scale that would make the devil himself blush. You want to stand in my way, Barton? You'll be standing in a cell next to Crow. Barton looked at the crowd, saw the way public opinion was turning, and stepped aside. Smart man, Wade said, and kept walking. They held a preliminary hearing that very afternoon in Harlan's small courthouse, Judge Morrison presiding. He'd ridden hard from Lexington to be there, determined to see justice done. One by one, the girls gave testimony, describing what had been done to them, the lies they'd been told, the abuse they'd suffered. Kate would have been among them, Ezra realized, if he hadn't pulled her from that warehouse 3 days ago. She would have been one more name in Crow's ledger, one more person sold like livestock. The judge's face grew sterner with each testimony. When the last girl finished speaking, Morrison looked at Silas Crow with undisguised contempt. Mr. Crow, he said, you have committed crimes so heinous that I can barely find words adequate to describe my disgust. You have taken the word of God and twisted it to justify evil. You have preyed upon the innocent and the helpless. You have sold human beings as if they were cattle. The court finds you guilty on all charges and sentences you to 25 years of hard labor at the state penitentiary. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court certainly will not. The crowd in the courtroom erupted in applause. Crow was led away in chains, his face finally showing fear as he realized the life he'd built on the suffering of others was truly over. Morrison also stripped Sheriff Barton of his badge for corruption and dereliction of duty, appointing a temporary replacement until proper elections could be held. The old order was falling, and something better, something cleaner, was rising to take its place. As the sun set on that long day, Ezra stood outside the courthouse with Marcus Wade. It's done, Wade said. Justice is served, at least for today. What happens to the girls? Ezra asked. We'll try to find the others who were sold, bring them back if they want to come. These 12 will help them however we can. Some have families they can go back to. Others, Wade shrugged, we'll figure something out. Maybe the church can help. Real church, not whatever twisted version Crow was peddling. Ezra nodded, then turned toward where Ash was tied. I need to get back to my mountain. There's a young woman and a boy there who've been alone long enough. Wade gripped his shoulder. You did good, Ezra. Better than good. You started this, and because of you, 28 people get their lives back. I just did what anyone should have done, Ezra said. But you're the one who actually did it, Wade replied. That matters. Ezra rode through the night, pushing Ash harder than he should have, driven by an urgency he couldn't name. As dawn broke, he finally crested the last ridge and saw his cabin below, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. Everything looked normal, safe. He urged Ash down the trail, and as he approached, the door opened. Kate stood there, framed in the doorway, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made something warm bloom in his chest. You came back, she said as he dismounted. I said I would, Ezra replied. Is Sam all right? He's fine, healing. Come see. Inside, Sam was sitting at the table, his broken arms still splinted, but his color much better. When he saw Ezra, his face brightened. Mr. Ezra, you're back. Did you catch the bad men? We caught them, Ezra confirmed. All of them. They're going to prison for a very long time. You're safe, Sam. Both of you are safe. Sam's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, tears of relief. He tried to speak, but couldn't get the words out past the emotion. Ezra crossed to him and put a hand on his shoulder. It's all right, son. You're allowed to cry. You've earned it. And so Sam cried and Kate cried with him, and even Ezra felt his eyes burning, though he was too stubborn to let the tears fall. They sat together in that small cabin while the morning light grew stronger outside, 3 people who'd been broken by the world but were starting perhaps to heal. Later, when Sam had fallen asleep from exhaustion, Kate and Ezra sat by the fire. She'd made coffee and they drank it in comfortable silence for a while. What happens now? Kate asked finally. Now you decide, Ezra said. Sheriff Wade is helping the other girls find their way home or find new lives. He'll help you too if that's what you want. You could go back to the church or find your family in Ireland or do anything you choose. You're free, Kate, truly free. And what do you want? She asked, looking at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through him. Ezra thought about that question, really thought about it. What did he want? For 5 years, he'd wanted nothing except to be left alone with his grief. But now, looking at this fierce young woman who'd survived hell and come out fighting, looking at the boy sleeping peacefully in his bed, he realized his wants had changed. "I want you to stay," he said finally. "If you want to. No obligations, no expectations. Just stay. Help me teach Sam to read and hunt and be something other than what the world tried to make him. Help me remember what it's like to have a purpose beyond just surviving." "Stay." Kate was quiet for a long moment, and Ezra held his breath, suddenly afraid she'd say no, that she'd choose freedom over staying in a rough cabin on a lonely mountain with a man who barely knew how to talk to people anymore. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise. "I'll stay," she said. "For now, at least. I'll stay." As spring came to the mountain, as the snow melted and the world turned green again, 3 people who'd been lost found something like a home in that cabin. Sam healed and grew stronger, his laughter filling the spaces that had been silent for too long. Kate taught him to read using Ezra's small collection of books, and taught Ezra to laugh again, which was harder than teaching a boy his letters. And Ezra taught them both to survive in the mountains, to read the weather and track game and live off the land. By summer, Sam's arm had healed completely, though it would always be a little crooked. He could chop wood now, could help with the hunting, could do a full day's work without complaint. Kate had gained back the weight she'd lost, her cheeks round and healthy, her copper-red hair growing long enough to braid. And Ezra smiled more, laughed more, lived more. They never talked about what they were to each other, this makeshift family. They didn't need to. Some things were understood without words. Kate was not his wife, not officially, though the way she looked at him sometimes made him wonder if that might change someday. Sam was not his son by blood, but in every way that mattered, the boy was his. On quiet evenings when Sam was asleep and Ezra and Kate sat by the fire, they'd talk about the future, about maybe adding another room to the cabin, about teaching Sam to read and write properly, maybe even sending him to a real school someday. About the other girls Wade had found, scattered across 3 states, some of them free now, some still fighting for their freedom. About hope. One evening in late June, as the sun set gold and red behind the mountains, Kate asked the question that had been hanging between them for weeks. "What are we, Ezra?" she said softly. "What is this?" Ezra looked at her, at this fierce young woman who'd survived hell and chose to stay in his rough cabin instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. "We're what we choose to be," he said finally. "No one else's definition matters." "And what do you choose?" she asked. He thought about it, really thought about it. For 5 years he'd been alone, wrapped in grief, waiting to die. "But now I choose this," he said. "You, Sam. This life, if you'll have it, if you'll have me." Kate smiled, and it was like sunrise. "I already chose, Ezra. I chose the day I stayed." And so they built something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. It wasn't the life Ezra had planned when he was 26 and newly married. It wasn't the life Kate had imagined when she took her vows at 15. It wasn't the life Sam had known before his uncle's cruelty. But it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. And high on Pine Mountain, in a cabin that held 3 people who'd learned that family isn't always blood, that home isn't always the place you're born, that redemption isn't always found in churches. A new story was beginning. The mountain had shown them mercy. Now they would show mercy to whoever came next, needing help, needing hope, needing home.